It is the biggest understatement of my life, past and future, to say that I am very happy to be here. And especially to stand before so many avid and truly interested readers, and I imagine writers as well. I'm really honored. I have a clicker here. Okay, whoops. It took an age to write The Mapmaker's Daughter, my first novel, and I can report from where I stand today, here, more than 20 years after I embarked on the book, that late blooming is to blooming what the new 70 is to 70. And that's good, because the point isn't when, the point is what and how. I want to tell you about the Mapmaker's Daughter, about who she really was and who she became to me. I want to tell you what happened to both of us. Over the decades of researching and writing and, spoiler alert, getting my book published, not even a handful of people knew I was working on it, getting crushed by it and uplifted by it, often in the same hour. So when the book came out, I did too, and not just to others. For years, I had hidden from my own ability behind a shield of artistic deference. All at once, I was disclosed, and by a work of fiction, no less. The idea for this undertaking was not mine. I went to college late, and as an older student at Princeton, I made friends with many of my teachers, none more important to me than the historian Bernard Lewis. He died not all that long ago at 102. But back in 1997, when he was 82 and I was middle-aged, he told me about an improbably influential woman in the 16th century Ottoman dynasty. She had risen to the height of power, but almost nothing was known about her. Her name was Nurbanu. Same name as yours, Bernard pointed out, which I actually already knew, because my maiden name, Nouri, means light, both in Arabic and in Turkish. You should write her story, he said, as fiction. I pointed out to him that I'd never written fiction. He told me that didn't matter. And when I reminded him I wasn't a scholar of the Ottoman Empire, he said that didn't matter either. And then he said something else really extraordinary, that we were going to write this book together. And when I asked him how on earth we were going to do that, he said, so characteristically, trust me. I mean, can you just see him saying that? And I did. The Mapmaker's Daughter is a story about trust. It is about a bond between two people, a 12-year-old Venetian girl and the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. It is a bond respected by one of them and manipulated by the other. Nurbanu's own story starts with her patrician and illegitimate birth and upbringing in Venice, her abduction at 12 by the admiral of the Ottoman fleet, and most importantly, her appeal to the Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, and his appeal to her. This is Suleiman. Of course, any image of these sultans is not from person. There are no images taken from the living subject. They're all from struck coins. Suleiman and Nurbanu are captivated by each other, he by the breadth of her education, and she by his authority. More than captivated, though, they need each other. And much as this girl needs that sultan, as we'll see, he needs her more. Assuring that your will is carried out when you're dead has its problems. It requires a person or a law or both. The Law of Fratricide was already on the books when Suleiman came to power. Its purpose was to ensure that one person and one person alone accede to the throne without a contest afterwards. Its purpose, in other words, was to avoid civil war. That law is the axis around which the Mapmaker's Daughter turns. Suleiman assigned Nurbanu to the son he intended to have succeed him. there's Suleiman again, Selim II. All of these three images, the one I just showed you of Suleiman, this one of Selim, and the next are all by the Venetian painter Veronese. Nurbanu bore for Selim a son of their own, Murad III. And that son, that grandson of Suleiman, was the key to all that happened to Nurbanu thereafter. And that is because Suleiman intended for that prince to be the sultan when the time came, that is, after he's gone. If fratricide is the axis of the story, that relationship between Nurbanu and Suleiman is its tilt. It accounts throughout the memoir for the light, often oblique, that is shed on Nurbanu's understanding of herself. It accounts for the darkness that she keeps encountering in her memory. Ultimately, it explains how her need to be legitimate caused her to think and to feel and to choose horribly. Nurbanu knows this, or she suspects it when, on her deathbed, she sets out to understand what has made her done the things that she has done over the course of a long and very consequential life. Her confession, her inquiry, belongs as much to the girl she was as to the woman she has become. It also belongs to me, to who I was when I set out on this, and to who I have become. Bernard gave me a syllabus. It took 1.5 years to read, and it gave rise to the many timelines and genealogies and charts that I created and pinned to a bulletin board that covered the entire wall above my desk. As I've been rummaging through my files recently, exhuming all of these visual aids, I've appreciated more than ever how important they were, especially when it came time to write. Yes, they kept me straight on a huge number of details, but just as important, they calmed me down. Many times, when I closed my eyes in fear of not finding a next sentence, and this literally happened a lot, I would remind myself to look up, and there, alongside all of my maps of Suleiman's conquered territories, were my allies, the facts. In 2001, I set about finding Nurbanu in every place that she might have lived or visited. As her interpreter, I needed to see what she had seen day in and day out. And if there were a chance of also seeing what might have struck awe in her, I wanted to see that too. I also wanted to see what might have scared her stiff. This meant weeks in Venice and on the island of Paros in the Cyclades, and it meant many months in Turkey, in Istanbul, up and down the coast, and out in Anatolia. Having no reason to doubt that history and all my research would serve as the fixed tracks upon which Nurbanu would power the story forth, I began to write. It always struck me as overboard that parents measure a 2-year-old's age in months until I finished that first draft, which took 22. I gave the rubber-banded 500 pages to Bernard, who, without looking at it, said, "Good, now write the next one." He did say he was going to enjoy reading it, but what he was more interested in was what was going to come next. And when I asked about his part was when he told me that I was going to do this book all by myself, which he had known all along, but that didn't mean that his official withdrawal didn't throw me. I believe I knew even then that the tome that I had handed in was really just a dressed-up chronology, that it didn't have an arc was the least of what it lacked. It didn't have a point. And it put zero flesh on a protagonist whose known identity was skeletal. So I returned to Istanbul to get my bearings, and the first place I went was Nurbanu's mosque. I had visited it once 3 years earlier, or I had tried to. On that visit, the taxi driver had sworn that no such place existed. And when I climbed out at the address, I could see why he thought so. The place was, or it certainly seemed to be, abandoned. it looked a lot grimmer and more overgrown than this. Every structure, the 3 schools and the this is a mosque complex, which is not atypical, with many, many buildings that serve the needs of the people. 3 schools, a library, the hospital, the baths, the dervish convent, and the so-called guest house for those who might be dying were locked tight. The only sounds were from birds in the remains of a linden tree by the ablution fountain. Lindens live for hundreds of years. They're like olive trees. And I stood next to that ancient trunk, and it was the first time I had the feeling that I was with her, that she might have even planted that tree. And I didn't feel that I was with her in her body. I felt I was with her in her time. It's a feeling I would have. I didn't have it many times afterwards, but I had it often enough so that it kept surprising me and sending me forth. When I returned 3 years later, okay, after Bernard's put me on my own, I was surprised that the taxi knew just where the mosque was. The compound was not only open, it was blooming and thriving. I hope you'll all go see this mosque. And at the heart of it was and is a mosque that is recognized as the gem in the crown of Sinan, the greatest architect the empire ever had. Take a look at this. That's its dome. And Nurbanu had I'm not going to go off into the story of the mosque now. I can do that later if you like, but she had an enormous amount to do with everything about this mosque compound. Version 2 of the book was less self-conscious. It was a lot leaner, and it took half the time to write. A serious publisher was taken by it and suggested restructuring it in a way she was kind enough to spell out. Better, she said a few months later. Still needs a story, though. Her life is the story, I said under my breath. Well, no, it wasn't. So that draft was history, too. And I was beginning to see that the very thing that made Nurbanu a good subject for fiction, that she was nearly a blank slate, was what was making it so hard to find or to imagine a story. And so I began to pursue tangents off of Nurbanu's biography in hope of finding that unidentified motherlode thing that had really occurred that would somehow yield the tale. The Istanbul Observatory, of which this is the only image we have, is a case in point. This observatory really existed. When it opened in 1577, on Nurbanu's watch, it was the most sophisticated observatory in the world. 3 years after it went up, it was demolished deliberately. A lot has been written about the observatory and what happened to it and why, but apparently nothing definitive. This seemed like a real opening to a real story. I read everything I could lay my hands on the subject, and then to find out conclusively what had happened, Bernard Lewis sent me to see Ekmelettin İhsanoğlu, known to many as the presidential candidate who came in second behind Recep Tayyip Erdogan in 2014. Before that, though, he was the founder of the Department of History of Science at Istanbul University. No one anywhere knows more than he does about what happened to that observatory. And at the end of a long and extraordinarily fruitful afternoon, he said, "No one can say for sure who destroyed it or why." I said, "You mean I can make it up?" And he said, "Yes, you can make it up." This was indeed great news. And I knew that the version that followed was better than the last because, among other things, it had forced me to rethink important relationships and to learn how much, or rather how little, technical information a fictional narrative can support. It's really hard to take out one's hard-earned research from a book. But the story of the observatory, which does remain in the finished work for all of its scientific importance and juicy and germane implications, was too far removed from Nurbanu's self to supply the story. And so, a word here about historical fiction. Maybe I'm kidding myself, but I really think that if I had understood that the term's operative word was fiction and not history, I wouldn't have kept thinking that the facts would yield up a plot. My obsession with details, their number and accuracy, also didn't help. What I needed was plain old verisimilitude. Not that that's a piece of cake, but I knew enough to beware of its archenemy, anachronism. And the way I did that was by making sure that there is not a word in this novel that wasn't in use in 1582, when Nurbanu died. And all I needed for that was an OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, or as my husband liked to call it, the QE2. I embarked on version 3, and I'm happy to tell you that something unanticipated accompanied the feeling of being almost sickeningly out there, and it was the feeling that Nurbanu was out there too, with me, that she needed me. I understood, and this is no euphemism, that I was responsible for her. Frankly, I think I might have understood that all along. It's probably why I wrote in the first person. I always knew that Nurbanu would speak better for herself than I possibly could. I was just writing on her behalf. A valuable dividend of this approach was discovering that Nurbanu, in her realness, didn't remember everything any more than I, as a writer, could imagine everything. The trick was to line up what she couldn't remember with what I couldn't imagine. The most technically difficult rewrite, and there had been several by this time, followed the counsel of yet another editor who loved the book, except for one thing, the structure. Weaving the backstory into every chapter was fiendishly hard to do. It took forever, and it made the book much better. The editor read it with care and appreciation, and no dice. When I was invited to this festival, I was told that listeners might be interested in my writing process. And I thought, my writing process? You know, that amounted to listening to suggestions from really interesting editors who kept turning my book down. So not all of these were turned down by people who were not me, but a lot of them were. And I would like to say that it is extremely, or to remind you, all of us, it is extremely easy to take failure for inadequacy, especially in oneself. And at that point, I could not see how else to take it. I love to write, but I could not bear to keep failing in that way. It was getting to a point where I couldn't, and I mean this literally, reimagine the book. I didn't have it in me, or so I thought. Mark Twain had advice for writers at this juncture. Write without pay until someone offers pay. If nobody offers within 3 years, you may look upon that as a sign that sawing wood is what you are intended for. 3 years, I was past 10. And in that very daunted state, I went back to the woodpile, otherwise known as the Encyclopedia of Islam. I dragged myself over to Firestone, Princeton's main library, to reread all the relevant entries, including on Suleiman, his father, his son, and his grandson. And then I found it, the unburied key, right on a page that I had easily read 10 times before. It's the entry on Murad III, Nurbanu's son. And it says, here we have Murad again. When he took the throne, a crucial and ghastly decision to carry out the law of fratricide, that is, to execute 5 young princes, was made against his will. What it doesn't say is who made the decision, or why, or with what effect. There it was, the story, and I knew it. All I had to do then was write it. From that moment on, my responsibility for Nurbanu became a shared purpose. She and I were looking for the same thing, and we would conduct our searches by the same means. We would very carefully look at what had happened to her from the time of her earliest memory, and we would do our best to make sense of it. From that point on, just like her, as she wrote her confession, I began to see. I was 60 when I embarked on that version, and finally I knew where I was heading. The story that followed was written with a confidence and therefore an energy that I had never experienced. The fact that I knew how much better the book wasn't why the next rejection was so hard. In fact, that one was in a class by itself. It did more than cut to the bone. It went to my heart, via my blood. Now, legitimacy is one of the toughest nuts that Nurbanu has to crack. In the story, being illegitimate is what makes her loathe her father, which matters very much, because from the day she lays eyes on Suleiman until the day she draws her last breath, she regards him, Suleiman, as the font of her legitimacy. She knows, and finally, over the days of writing her life down, she can acknowledge that her consuming need to be legitimate is what caused her to take leave of herself when she ordered the execution of 5 little boys. She doesn't fail to note that long before she gave that ghastly order, she had actually been made legitimate by her imperial marriage, which is to say, legitimacy is tricky, because it's both a fact and a feeling, and the feeling is more important. Nurbanu knew this, and I do too. In the introduction to the book, I mentioned my father, that getting into the story allowed me to learn about him. Only then did he tell me the details of his father's murder in front of the whole family in Baghdad when he was 12 in 1930. When he came to America, never to return to Iraq, my father's first goal was to get a degree, which he never did, and that was why he was obsessed with my getting one. He wanted for me and for himself through me that legitimacy. I wanted it too, very much. Though I have to say that my desire for a degree turned out to be nothing compared to my desire to get my book published. I was determined to get that credential, that thing that makes a person believable, officially. If only because this book could be seen as an extension and an expression of my education, I was certain that my father would be interested in it, until I gave him a draft to read. He held it up, he tapped it with a finger, and he put it down. He never said a word about it, not then or ever. I believe I came too close to his past. This was when I stopped writing. I surrender, I told my husband. That's okay, he said. Surrendering isn't quitting. This was a perfect example of his always being ahead of me while having my back. That's Robert. It has only been in preparing these remarks that I have considered why my father's rejection is the one that brought me to a halt. I've been my toughest judge all my life, but I had never seen that behavior as a pretext for allowing the views and the feelings of others, even the ancient wounds of others, to determine my self-regard, especially as a writer. Only now do I see that my father's blows, the one he had suffered and the one he landed on me, were just too big to pretend about. Very slowly, over months of not writing, I began to see. And I saw that I'd been confusing the need to change something, the book, with the imperative to change someone. Listening carefully to all those publishers' helpful suggestions was no substitute for listening to myself and for myself. I have known since an early age that to love is to be vulnerable and worth it. I didn't know till I was old how similar that is to writing fiction. There is no point in doing it unless you are in it, truly in and truly you. I started over. This was the rewrite prescribed and enforced by me. And as soon as I began, I heard Nurbanu change. I didn't decide this. She came back to me, and she sounded different. She sounded like someone who knew dread and vulnerability and the beginning of acceptance. She sounded like me. What followed then was a rewriting that, among other things, yielded a new plot in which love and death are forms of illumination, and that brought me the publisher of my dreams. The Mapmaker's Daughter was conceived as an end-of-life memoir. So there had always been 2 narrative arcs, the long one of Nurbanu's life and, is this going down or up? Oh, down. And the short one of her deathbed days when she recalls her life. But it wasn't until I started over that I understood that those arcs, their points of friction, could move the wheels of Nurbanu's conscience. That is what allows Nurbanu to see the truth over the days that are left to her and to tell it. Every day of her decline, her voice is more audible. Her words are more legible. She is making a map. This draws me finally to the third arc, the arc of my own life. Because of what I have come to know over these years, especially about loss of life and of illusion, I am able to lead Nurbanu to apply what she has come to know in hers. When the first copy of the book arrived, I took it from the envelope with obstetric care. I stared at the purple cover with Nurbanu's face, and I was aware I was feeling something I had never felt before. I was proud. And it was another book. I was proud of myself. And I was certain that every season of what had gone into what was there in my hands had been necessary for the feeling. I have not looked at the world in the same way since. I'm not overstating this. When I was 44, I wasn't married, I hadn't dreamed of writing a novel, and I wasn't a grandmother. Now I'm on Medicare, my grandson is in business school, my husband has died, and I am here with you. I'm on a steep learning curve. Sometimes it planes off, I take a deep breath, I marvel at new views, but what I look forward to is the return of the climb. After all, when we're young, we have the advantage of thinking we'll live forever. And when we're old, we have the advantage of knowing we won't. No matter what, my life and I are going to keep changing. I know this. Changing not only does not threaten who I am, it is freeing me to be who I am. And to the degree I can see it for what it is and enjoy it while it's happening, I'm going to try to do that too. I want to thank you again for being here, and I'd be very happy to entertain questions if you have them. Yes. I am. I'm a little loath to talk about it, but I can tell you it is fiction, and it's set in the present day. And ultimately, like this book about Nirvana, it'll certainly wind up being autobiographical. What else could I do at this stage except write about myself? I was afraid I was going to get a question about Charles V or the Battle of Lepanto. Yes.
Do you have an agent doing some or any of this?
That's a really interesting question. I did, and she finally bailed out after about the eighth, rejection. So yeah, you know the experience. I don't blame her. She's a wonderful agent. She did her absolute best, but she wasn't around for the last rewrite, and I wouldn't have been around either if I had been her. But she was great. Yes.
When you spend this much time on one story and then it culminates with your book being published, is that like the turning of a page or now you embark on your next journey? Or is this a story that's been so commingled with yours that you find yourself at night on Google looking for, still researching and being...
About her?
Yeah, will you always be curious about the story even though the book's published?
Well, she's one of my Google alerts. I mean, that sort of answers the question. So was Suleiman. God, when I was going through my notes before coming here, I always referred to her in my notes to myself. I referred to her in the first person as though I was her. I mean, it was really mixed up. Am I going to go on to other things? Yes, I am. But I think she'll never not be with me. I learned too much from her. And here is an amazing thing, and this happened only last weekend. I was noodling around in just the spirit you're speaking of, and I stumbled upon a monograph, a scholarly monograph that was published only last year, and it's about her mosque. Nothing had been written about this mosque complex, and its importance can't be overstated, both in the history of Sinan, that architect, and to Nurbanu, because it's built as a result of a charitable foundation, so it ministers to, its purpose is charitable. So the intentions of the donor say a lot about the donor. And so much of what this monograph learned from the tiles, which are inscribed with Nurbanu's intentions, confirm things, qualities about her that I had only inferred, but it turned out I was not too far of the mark about how compassionate she was and what a really bad temper she had. And there's one, she talks about the hospice and how to treat people who are admitted to the hospice and the hospital. No doctor will in any way disobey these written rules, she says, for otherwise his salary will have been earned in sin and it will doom him to endless torment in hell. I mean, you know, she was serious. So she'll always be with me. And isn't it a little creepy that she has my own name? Yeah. Yes.
What happened to the professor? How did he figure into all this?
Oh, he was hugely supportive. He gave me the blurb of one's dreams that's on the back of my book. He did read almost every draft. He was, you know, when he said we were going to write it together, that was his way of just getting me going. He knew I wouldn't have done it if he hadn't put it that way. But by reading every draft, by pointing me in important directions, that's mainly what he did. He didn't tell me what was wrong. He told me about places I wouldn't, I mean, kind of figurative places that I wouldn't have known to go to. And he was very, very happy with it. And as I said, he died 2 years ago in May at 102. He's worth Googling, Bernard Lewis. He's not uncontroversial, but there's no controversy about his stature as an historian. And it just happens that he and I didn't agree politically, and it's just a commentary on how one can separate all of that. I loved him more than I disagreed with him. So, yes. Well, it was somebody who had expressed, the publisher is somebody who had expressed an interest actually all along. This is so pathetic. This is about my memory. And I'd kind of forgotten that she had. And then finally I remembered that, gee, I could show it to that person. And lo and behold, she saw the truth in it, and is a fantastic editor as well. Yes?
Your title, The Mapmaker's Daughter, suggests that your heroine is the daughter of a mapmaker.
I'm so glad you said that. That was sort of the point. Yeah, I figure most people would think that. Now, why is that? Isn't it interesting? It is a true fact that patrician girls in Venice of that time were as educated as their brothers. This was true, well, it would have plausibly been true about Nurbanu, and I made it to be true about her mother, too, that she was highly educated and would have been able to, well, that she, had read Euclid really carefully and Regiomontanus, and it's plausible that she could have drawn maps. There's the figurative meaning of the map and about her trying to know where she's going. Nurbanu in her life. I mean, that's why she's lying on her deathbed she really is trying to make a a map. I mean, Piri Reis, the great map maker of the time, said a place hasn't been discovered until you can find it again, which I think is an interesting idea. And so the title is deliberate, and I'm glad you picked up on the male part of it. It's all about, this story is really about women, strong women who want to be and are determined to be honest with themselves. That's really what it's about. I bet there are a few of you here, aren't there? Can you say that last part again?
She said, Teresa Babylon, when she began consciousness, said, Carolyn, we are going to write this book
Together, wow.
She felt her presence for the 3 or 4 years that she was writing, like a hum back in her mind.
Wow.
Sometimes a candle, a flame of candle. And so when the book was over, it was finished. And she felt her presence also. I was wondering if
No, I wasn't. Okay, so our questioner here mentioned somebody who wanted to write about Teresa of Avila. What's that? The 13th century, I guess, for it, and didn't dare, but was giving a talk and collapsed on stage. And when she came to, she felt that she was inhabited by Teresa of Avila. To which I say, lucky her. I mean, you know, I did not have that experience. God knows what the book would have been like if that had happened. What's that?
the book was over, Teresa left her.
Yeah. Well, maybe she's probably lucky given Teresa of Avila's life, right? But yeah, she is still with me. But she's, as I would say, yeah, she is, but not in a creepy way. I'm going to leave it at that. Yeah.
And then one with it enriched. What happened?
You know, I don't know. That's something that I'm going to try and find out, which shouldn't be too. But it was just eerie to go back and, you know, I couldn't believe it that it was deserted, and I couldn't believe that it had suddenly been restored. It wasn't because of me and my interest, but yeah, it was odd. There are more minutes here. Yes.
I know that there have been documentaries on Suleiman. Is there any talk, or is there a future in possibly a docudrama?
About the book? So our questioner is asking about a docudrama about the book. There has been some interest expressed in my book, but there's also a huge blockbuster that was on in Turkey, actually, indeed, all over Western and Eastern Europe, called Magnificent Century. And you can see I think it ran for 4 seasons before Erdogan actually shut it down, which is really wild because he considers himself a great Ottomanist, and it's actually because he reveres Suleiman so much that he didn't like this westernized picture of Suleiman offered, but it's actually very good, Magnificent Century. So this is being done. It's a period, it's the Ottoman Empire at its absolute height, and Suleiman is just an endlessly interesting character. Tons has been written about him and about his wife, whose name was Hurrem. It's just interesting that one generation down, because Nurbanu is Suleiman's daughter-in-law, Zilch, the only people who had access to the harem were actually these liminal characters, mainly agents and eunuchs. And the agents, there's an agent who figures prominently in the story, were female, and they were always Jewish. And they had usually come from, Iberia. They'd left after the expulsion, found their way across Europe through Venice, wound up in the Ottoman Empire, where they were not only tolerated but given really good jobs. This is why all of the physicians in Topkapi Palace at the time, they were all Jews. So yeah, there's a whole sub-story about the importance of Jews in this picture. Yes.
Would you be comfortable talking about politics of what's happening there now?
No, I don't. That's beyond my purview. But suffice it to say that it's interesting. I mean, you can infer certain things from the fact that Erdogan likes to identify. You know, he doesn't like Ataturk. He loves Suleiman, and he doesn't want anyone messing with his idea of Suleiman. So you can. Oh, here's something I wanted to show you that I found as I was. Look at this is 20 years ago to the day, this newspaper. This is when I was one of my early trips. And it's talking about Turkey joining the EU, that it's like a done deal. I mean, right? Nothing changes, right? It's amazing. Yes.
How many languages do you read and speak?
Well, I can easily read French. I can get along in Italian. I studied Arabic for my degree, but I can't read it anymore. That period. So, and I had Bernard with it for the Turkish. I have no Turkish. But I'd be lying if I said that the Arabic really helped me. But anyway. But the Italian was helpful when I went into the archives in Venice. They took a book off of the shelf in the archive in Venice that had letters from her in it. Yeah, it was incredible because she was, well, I didn't mention this, she was related to the Doge. She was his niece. This is really true. And so there was a correspondence, and the gigantic books with, you wonder how long the dust has been collecting on them, and they have huge ribbons around them, and the ribbons kind of disintegrate when they open the book. So I could read those, because isn't that interesting? There she is sitting there in the harem in Istanbul, and she's writing in Italian to her cousin. This really is cool.
Do you know how or the circumstances of her capture?
I made them up, basically. We do know that she was captured by by Barbarossa himself. He was he's the most famous corsair of the time. It was he who put basically all of North Africa under the Ottoman flag for Suleiman. And it is not implausible, or it wouldn't have been in my book, that he himself was there at her capture from the island of Paros. And the reason we even get into Paros, which is today in Greece, is because all of those islands were Venetian possessions at the time. So, by the way, the sultans only married Christian slaves. There's a reason for this. They didn't want pesky in-laws who were royalty in other lands. But what these girls had to endure, the capture, the trips. I mean, whether it's her on a ship or whether it's from the Ukraine. It was ghastly what they underwent. So these girls were strong.
Several years ago, probably about 3 years now, my husband and I were watching a series, I think on Netflix, about Suleiman and his harem. I mean, it was really cheesy, okay? And
It's probably the one I'm describing.
It wasn't well done, but there was the Christian blonde or redhead who
Right.
got captured and
Right.
became one of his, part of the harem.
Right.
Yeah, it was kind of cheesy, but I don't know, we watched it.
Well, you're describing Magnificent Century, and actually, the woman who plays harem is German. I mean, it's weird, but I really loved it. Yeah. Yes. Oh boy, that's a whole other story. It was acquired by the largest publisher in Turkey about 5 years ago. I was told, and they said they would translate it. I was told that I should absolutely have it translated myself, that I should find my own translator and pay that person, because the translators are paid so little that you get a job that reflects the pay. I did all that. The translation exists. The book was to come out in May of 2017. It didn't. I call up to find out they stall. July comes, there's the coup attempt, and my book was canceled. Just nullified. They broke the contract, and they said that it was historically inaccurate. I mean, it's really. So it was just, another minor casualty. But they fired all the teachers and all the professors, and so there's that. Well, I'm down to 17 seconds, and I want to use them to say thank you again so much for coming.